Supernatural traps are often built on a foundation of stolen identities. This process doesn't begin with an attack, but with a specific architectural layout that leaves a victim exposed while they sleep. Annie's parents spent months searching, eventually settling on a house that looked ideal, except for one detail: an abandoned structure sitting directly behind it. Because Annie's room was at the back, her window created an unbroken connection to the empty house. Annie immediately felt the danger, but her parents were focused on the struggle of the move. They viewed her fear as a tantrum and insisted she set up her room, effectively forcing her to occupy the most vulnerable point in the house. By prioritizing the logistics of the move over their daughter's discomfort, the parents established the physical conditions the entity needed. They placed Annie in an isolated environment where she was always visible from the shadows. The figure in the abandoned house didn't need to force its way inside immediately. It required a period of observation, building a link with the target through repeated, undisturbed contact. This entity relies on a persistent, two-way visual connection. It needs to see the victim, and the victim needs to see it, creating a bridge between the two houses that grows stronger every time their eyes meet. As the days passed, Annie's initial panic began to fade. As she grew accustomed to the view, she stopped closing the curtains, giving the entity the time it needed to fixate on her position. This window-to-window sightline served as a physical vector. Without this direct, unobstructed path between their rooms, the entity would have had no way to initiate the next phase of its plan. At 9 p.m., the connection is finalized. Annie looks out her window and sees a silhouette. It is a solitary figure, standing perfectly still in the darkness of the abandoned house, staring back at her. Annie immediately ran to her mother, looking for protection and a witness who could confirm that the figure in the window was real. Her mother looked but saw nothing. She told Annie she was simply imagining things, suggesting that watching too many horror movies had distorted her perception of the dark. This dismissal created a protective layer for the entity. Because the mother refused to believe the threat existed, the figure was free to remain in the window without the family taking any steps to flee or secure the house. The entity successfully tested the family's internal logic. It discovered that as long as the parents could explain away the danger, they would remain in place, leaving Annie completely unprotected. The following night, the figure appeared again. Annie's screams for help were louder this time, but the response from her parents was even more dismissive. Her mother reached for a new explanation. It was Halloween season, and neighborhood kids were likely playing a prank. She told Annie to go back to sleep and stop waking up her father. By calling the figure a prankster, the mother changed how Annie's brain processed the threat. This input shifted Annie's mental state from a place of paralyzing fear into a state of aggressive anger. This anger overrode Annie's survival instincts. Instead of hiding, she felt a need to retaliate. She decided that if the person in the window was just a local kid, she would catch them herself and make sure they were punished. The trap worked by guiding the victim's emotions. By the time Annie decided to leave her room to confront the figure, she was no longer being hunted. She was walking into the snare of her own free will. At 9 p.m., Annie crossed the yard and entered the abandoned house. She was so focused on catching the prankster that she didn't hesitate to step into the absolute darkness of the hallway. She climbed to the top floor and reached the window where the figure had stood. When she looked back across the yard toward her own bedroom, she saw her mother through the glass. Annie watched as a version of herself walked into the room and spoke to her mother. The link was complete. The entity had used the open path Annie left behind to step into her life. Annie ran back downstairs, but the front door she had left open was now jammed. No matter how hard she pulled with all her strength, the handle wouldn't turn. The exit was permanently sealed. The door locked the moment the entity successfully took Annie's place in the other house. The two spaces had swapped roles. The abandoned building was now Annie's home, and her bedroom was now the entity's territory. Annie remained trapped in the rotting building, an inhabitant of the darkness she once feared. Across the yard, the entity now lives in her house, sleeping in her bed and eating with her parents, who see nothing wrong with their daughter. The parents' insistence that the danger wasn't real allowed the monster to move in undetected. Their family has been replaced, and they are none the wiser. In this case, the human need to find a logical explanation for the unknown provided the cover the entity needed. By the time the parents finished rationalizing the threat had already won.